On Friday, Silverstone managing director Stuart Pringle suggested that the circuit could host 2 rounds of the 2020 F1 World Championship if needed, with the second race being held on a reverse layout of the Northamptonshire circuit. Now, I have no idea how plausible that actually is, but I thought it would make a fun piece of content for the channel today. Unfortunately, the guys at the race got there first, so I thought, why not take the idea and run with it? Hello fellow sim racers. The premise for today's video is simple. Take a look at how well suited several of the popular F1 circuits are to being driven in the wrong direction, or the Pringle way if you will. You'll notice that these are pretty much exclusively old school circuits, and that's because the more modern venues with their spacious tarmac runoff just sort of work in reverse, which makes for a boring video. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a fairly suitable candidate. I decided to start out with Barcelona for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's still by and large an old school track with grass and gravel, and secondly, it's quite a spacious venue, so theoretically walls could be moved and runoff areas extended if needed. Joining the lap on board, and the new turn 1 is a super fast left-hander that requires serious commitment. The much hated chicane serves no purpose at all on the reverse layout, so we'll presume the MotoGP layout will be adopted. The long, sweeping turn 3 becomes a fun little late apex affair, as does the hairpin, which seems to require an almost V-shaped line in order to maximise speed out onto the back straight. The straight itself is too short to offer any overtaking opportunities in any direction in modern cars, but Camp's turn is terrifying whichever way you run through it. The old turn 6 and 7 chicane becomes an awkward right-hander by virtue of the fact that the exit curb stops short of where it needs to be, but that's an easy fix. Sayat corner is just as clumsy in reverse, but the camber at the top of the hill makes applying the power all the more tricky. Repsol corner becomes an exercise in patience as you gradually scrub off speed throughout the turn, waiting for the ridiculously late apex to finally appear. And it's much the same situation for what was turn 3, only quite a lot faster as you line yourself up at the final right and left chicane. Don't take too much curb or you'll unsettle the car like I did, and pay no attention to the wall on the right hand edge of the track. And that's it for a lap of Barcelona in reverse. The circuit has great flow and is surprisingly decent to drive. There are a few places where walls and stands would have to be relocated, but in the scheme of things, I'd say this one is more than plausible. Next up, we're taking a look at Spa, because honestly, that's what I expect most of the comments to be about. This is another circuit with quite a lot of space to modify runoff areas, but there's also some fairly impressive topography to contend with. Bus Stop really wasn't designed to be traversed in this direction, and it's pretty horrible if I'm honest, but there's a functional curb on the outside so we can make it work. Now, because we're now in an acceleration zone, Blanchimont is child's play, which is a shame really, but it's more than made up for in a few corners time, so stick with it. The run down the hill is very much an exercise in mentally preparing yourself for Stavelot corner, which in reverse is an almost flat out flick to the left, followed immediately by the braking zone for Campus. The Fania chicane is strangely familiar in the reverse layout, and thankfully there are curbs in all the right places too. Not that I particularly troubled the curb on the exit on this lap. Pouhon requires a different line, but the same sort of throw it in and trust the aero mentality, and it's arguably a bit more exciting this way around as well. Speaking of exciting, No Name is a terrifying flick to the right. Don't touch the curb though or you'll be halfway up the cliff. Bruxelles in reverse seems to suit a later apex since there's a bigger acceleration zone now before Malmedy. The left-hander at Malmedy is really all about positioning the car for Les Combes, which is now a critical acceleration zone onto the long Kemmel straight. The straight is now downhill, which should aid the pickup a little bit, but that'll soon be forgotten when you arrive at the drop-off that is Radillon. And here is why Spa would never work in reverse. Sure, it's spectacular, but it would be impossible to mitigate the possibility of a serious air crash. And all that's left to think about now is La Source, which is honestly pretty similar to the regular layout, only without a curb on the outside to tame your enthusiasm. So that's an anti-clockwise lap of Spa. Sadly, the hilly nature that gives this circuit its fearsome reputation looks like it would be more than problematic in reverse. probably best to keep this one in the virtual realm then. The Österreich ring, or A1 ring, or Red Bull ring, or whatever you want to call it, fits the bill nicely as well, with the Sound of Music geography giving plenty of space around the track to make amendments to safety features. But that doesn't stop Turn 1 from being incredibly clumsy thanks to an inner curb that's really not suited to the reverse layout. Avoid at all costs. Rint corner is suitably on edge and makes the driver work just as hard as in the regular layout, while the Worth S is incredibly quick in this direction. Flat out for the left-hander, down 2 gears for the right, and then straight into the long right-hander, which is much improved in this direction in my opinion. Perhaps the trickiest corner on the circuit is Schlossgold, which in the normal configuration is tough to find the right acceleration point, while in this layout it's the braking point for the late apex turn-in that's equally tricky. Speaking of tricky, spotting the braking point for Remus is tough, but seeing the apex is actually impossible as the circuit drops away quickly. This corner is much tougher in this direction, and it's not helped by an inside curve that really doesn't want you to bounce over the top of it. The run down the hill feels shorter than usual, and the circuit seems to narrow as we head towards the final turn. A fun little flick across the curb, careful not to get too greedy, and then on to the next lap. All in all, a good candidate for driving in reverse, though a couple of the curbs do make life harder than it needs to be. That all being said, I think the racing will suffer here, as the braking zone into the final corner really isn't very wide at all. There's still time for one sensible circuit before I show you just how loathsome Monaco is in reverse. Monza is situated in a fairly tight park locale, but from what I can see, all of the important areas where modifications would need to be made to run off have the appropriate space. The character of Monza doesn't really change all that much when you switch it around, but the biggest change is right at the start of the lap, with Curva Parabolica becoming a really technical late apex corner. Probably more fun the other way around, but it's not without its charms in reverse either. Ascari is always an event, and this is no different. The fast right-hander, slowing left into the final right that has no curb or no runoff, makes this a particularly tricky affair. Oh, and the curbs don't work this way around at all. We get a much nicer view of the old banking in this orientation, though the trade-off is that the Lesmo corners that we're approaching are pretty dire in this orientation, thanks to the curbs being in all of the wrong places. Careful with the grass on the outside of what is now Lesmo 1, and Lesmo 2 is much the same, ultimately feeling a little bit more clumsy than it needs to be. Della Roggia is fairly similar, though the lack of exit curb may mean that we need to trust the coefficient of friction on the grass. It's either that or slow down a bit more, which just doesn't really feel like the right call. Curva Grande is a non-event still, though we don't have much time to line up for the braking zone for the Rettifilio chicane. Like the bus stop at Spa, this really doesn't work this way round at all, and at the risk of repeating myself, feels so clumsy. Monza sort of works out in reverse, but I feel that it loses some of the flow. The chicanes, designed to slow the cars from the old boot layout, are in all of the wrong places, and everything just feels a little bit off. So that brings us to Monaco, a circuit that barely works properly even in the right direction. I've included this for a bit of fun, but honestly, driving this was extremely frustrating. Every single corner seems to have a bit of barrier sticking out at just the wrong point. The kink before Antinoge means that you have to take a weird entry into the corner, though it does spit you out in the right place for La Rascasse. The barrier is closer on the exit than you think as the circuit tightens here. The swimming pool is terrible, the inner barrier tries to eat you and the outer barrier juts out on the exit, best forgotten about. The run down through to back is just as breathtaking in reverse, though it seems some things do remain sacred. The Nouvelle Chicane, however, not so much. Although it is arguable whether this is really necessary to include in the reverse layout at all, though I'd have to go back to a pre-1976 layout to test that theory. The tunnel is pretty much the same in reverse, but braking for Portier is much more interesting. The flow through this part of the track really does get lost, and every point from here up to Mirabeau feels awkward. It probably doesn't help that I haven't really set the car up for Monaco either. On the outside of Mirabeau there's of course a bit of barrier sticking out, and you can't avoid the bump into Casino Square or you'll be on the wrong side of the track. However, once you're done with the casino, it all suddenly gets good again as you blast through Massenet, down the hill, and start to think about picking your braking point for Saint-Devote. You can take a lot of curb, but once again, the barrier on the outside wants to eat you. And that is the last time I'll be running Monaco in reverse. So guys, that just about wraps things up for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, it would be great if you could hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you can see more content like this in the future. So all that's left to say is goodbye, thank you for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.